Welcome to the JB Font channel. I am your host, James Fauntleroy. So good to see all of you here on this beautiful day. The JB Font channel is available on all major podcast platforms, so go ahead and subscribe there. Also part of Revolutionary Blackout Network. So if you guys want to, you guys can see me on Sundays and Thursdays. If you have not already, please go ahead and also subscribe to my Substack. It's at jbfont.substack.com, so you can get email notifications whenever I go live, upload clips, or write any articles. So you have that there instead of having to rely on the tubes, as it were. So it's actually more reliable getting it from me than them. So thank you very much for that. Also, if you guys have not already, you guys can go ahead and give the stream a like. That actually pushes me out into the algorithm. So I appreciate it so very much. Now, what are we talking about today? We're going to get into it. We are reading, of course, Of Water in the Spirit, Ritual, Magic, and the Initiation in the Life of an African Shaman by Melodoma Patrice Somé. We are going to continue in chapter 2, and we're going to be doing the second part of chapter 2. So last time when we were reading, we're actually going into his Melodoma's farewell to his grandfather. We're speaking about the process, the ritual of essentially saying goodbye to a loved one. And so this is going to be something I think is important to get context of, especially in regards to indigenous Africans. Remember that they are in Burkina Faso. Before it was called Burkina Faso, it was called Upper Volta. So we're going to be looking into that. And we're going to be going even deeper into the ritual for how things are when it comes to their, dearly departed loved ones. So we're going to get into that right now. We're starting on at the end of page 42, and then we'll finish up the chapter. And of course, I have some thoughts. So, ready? All right. Grandfather paused. The strange vibration in the room stopped. My consciousness shifted. I was back in the everyday world, and I could now see him as a normal man. His face was shiny with sweat as if it had been anointed with sacred oil. His cheeks were smooth and round and had almost no wrinkles, as if he has reclaimed his youth. He looked 20 years younger. His eyes, wet tears, were shining with intensity, and I wondered why he had been crying. He looked like somebody who had just come back from an emotional intensity of a funeral rite and was still in the process of adjusting to the ordinary world. You got to remember, Melodoma was like 4 years old at this moment. And imagine being a 4-year-old and seeing your grandfather sweating in tears, crying, It's something to think about, And that's that developmental stage. He was soaked with sweat. His double voyage into the future and back to the past had taken a great deal of energy. Later, when I was older, I would recall this moment with grandfather as the most intense learning experience of my life. Outside, the burning disk of the sun was slipping towards its resting place. I thought of my parents on the farm, far away, and how they were getting ready to return home and take their hard-won rest. Suddenly, the sound of breaking clay pots shattered in silent air, probably the one we had used for dinner the night before. Nobody ever had time to clean them before going to sleep. People worn out by an entire day of heavy labor who must be up at dawn to repeat the same monotonous work have no time for housework. The noise was immediately followed by the sound of hooves. The main gate had been left open, and the goats and sheep had crept in, searching for scraps of food to supplement their diet of grass. "Go kick these animals' asses out of the yard," grandfather ordered. I jumped to my feet, ready to run out and chase them out of the compound. "And close the gate before you come back," he added. And I was already at the door. The animals knew somebody was coming because they all turned and ran out quickly before I could kick the ass of even one of them. They had broken the clay pot and licked out anything that tasted like food. And I knew that when my mother got home, she would storm at me for my negligence for forgetting to close the door behind me when I returned from my trip to a baobab tree. But there was nothing I could do about that now except shut it quickly and rush back to grandfather's room. "It took you long enough to return. Didn't those goats want to leave? Come, let me finish with you. Then you can go wait for your parents. I would like to take a rest." Grandfather was sitting up now and leaning back against the sand pillow. I approached and settled at the bottom of his sleeping mat, which was warm and soaked with sweat, as if he had just sat up. Presently, he resumed his unearthly aspect, and the voice began speaking shrilly through his body again. "Very soon you will leave this house to investigate the land of the Nipula." The white man began. "In fact, it will be the hardest thing you will ever do. I'm in pain for you, but there is nothing I can do about it. What is decreed is decreed. Our ancestors have told us that the best way to know who the Nipula is to get closer to him. Iron cuts iron, but iron can only cut iron if it rubs itself against iron. The desire for such knowledge is good, but actually getting that knowledge is another story. Let the ancestors' will be done. Remember, however, that in the process of fulfilling your life's mission, that you must not forget that your roots are here with us. I say this because I know the hardships that await you. You will soon be shot into the void like an arrow, flying like a bird, diving the way of an alligator dives to the bottom of the river. But remember, the arrow shot into the air always returns to earth. The bird, however high it may fly, the alligator can dive deep into the water, but it must always return to the surface to breathe. Remember where you come from. The day you pluck the Nipula secret, run. Even if you are at the other side of the world, run back and tell us. You are Birafor, my brother, former priest of the tribe. You hold the destinies of thousands of souls, the souls of your people. Remember, to suffer for them is a credit to your name. You have come back for that. I salute you. Now I must go." Saying this, grandfather stretched and lay back down on the mat with his eyes. I could think of nothing to say. I did not really comprehend what he had told me anyway. Understanding would come later, when I was older and was helped to remember. Grandfather closed his eyes and remained still, as if sleeping. My thoughts slumbered in response to his stillness, and I could not decide whether to leave or stay in this darkening room. My indecision embarrassed me, but at the same time I felt a deep peace flowing into my body through my back. It seemed as if a spirit was breathing fresh air into me. This freshness invaded my body, and I became so cool and relaxed, I thought I was going to fall asleep too. I do not know how long I remained in that state. What I do remember is the return of the field workers from the farm and a great explosion produced by my mother as she dropped her load of dry wood in the middle of the yard. The sound dragged me back to reality, and I wondered at how quickly the day had passed. Slowly, I crept toward the doorway, avoiding the row of gourds in the middle of the room. Outside, it was dark. The sky, as usual, with, was peopled with countless bright spots, all dancing to the rhythm of an unheard drum. Far in the west, I could see the place where the sun had went down. Everything else was shrouded in a veil of mysterious darkness. Soon my father arrived. He pushed the English bicycle into the yard and rushed into grandfather's room. I walked around searching for my mother, for I had not eaten the whole day and was mournfully hungry. I found her catching her breath in the huge hall. As if knowing what I was coming to her for, she pointed to her left breast and assumed a quiet position. Even though I had been weaned long ago, I was used to eating solid food. My mother still breastfed me from time to time as a snack when no food was readily available, or when she sensed that I needed tenderness and reassurance. The day with my grandfather had been bewildering and stretched my young limits to the utmost. I do not know how long on I hugged on to my grand I'm sorry, sorry. I do not know how long I hugged on my mother's breast. Suddenly, I was startled by the noise of the engine outside the house. My mother pushed me away and rushed out. Disoriented, I remained in the dark for a while, then followed her. Father Father Melot, the Jesuit priest who had always visited the family, was standing there in the yard, speaking very loudly in a very bad Dagara. Several people surrounded him, most of them from the other compounds. Father Melot barked out a command, and my father and one other person went into grandfather's room and came out carrying him. The little crowd joined in the carrying, and together they moved him out of the yard. I followed them. They put grandfather and a few of his personal belongings into the car. Shortly after, the car groaned and illuminated the whole yard, turning around and headed toward Mission Hill. My father grabbed his bicycle. Grandfather, to the dispensary. I'm going with you, I said. The night will be very cold, and you're not well protected. Just go inside and wait here. I will return. I screamed and yelled and fell down on the ground, pedaling my feet in the air with frenzy. My father sighed deeply, as if he didn't know whether to get angry at me or not. The next thing I knew, I was behind him on the baggage rack. The dispensary was built a few years after the missionaries settled in Dano. It was the same dispensary that I had avoided being born at. The first Jesuit to arrive in our territory looked like an explorer. He spent his first 6 months living in a hut down the hill. An administration building connected to the white colonial government and the church now sits on the site where he used to live. He paved the way for the other Jesuits by maintaining a steadily growing Christian community. When the others came, they built a huge house for themselves and a church for everybody all on top of the hill. From the valley eastward, everyone could see the steeple of that church. I knew none of the people up there except Father Milot, who was a frequent visitor to our village. Now we're getting into the colonial aspect of it all. If, as we read, it's going to feel like an intrusion in a way to the Dagara tribe. It's gonna feel like an intrusion, and I kind of see it like that myself. Like, you know, let's continue. Take a sip of tea. Next to the church, there were a couple of houses where sick people were treated with modern medicine. It was there that grandfather was taken. A pudgy man examined him as we waited in silence. Next, grandfather was taken to the dispensary room where he lay unconscious. Calling his name, I rushed over to him and grabbed his hand. "Don't touch him," my father roared. But grandfather opened his eyes and, seeing me, smiled faintly and closed them again. I sat next to him, my left hand in his right hand. Nobody said anything more. All the faces around me were shrouded with sadness. I didn't know why, but I did not care as long as grandfather was there. When I woke up in the morning, I was not beside grandfather, but in one of the corners of the tiny cement room. I stretched my legs, rubbed my eyes, and looked around me. The sun had already risen. Its penetrating rays were already biting my skin through the corrugated iron roof of the building. Grandfather was still laying there, and where I had seen him last night. He seemed to be in a deep sleep. I got up and walked to him. Picking up one of his hands, I called him aloud. He did not answer. When I called him again, he remained quiet. My father was not around, and I didn't know any of the many villagers in the room. I sensed, however, that they must be the leaders of other compounds. I looked at them for help to find out why grandfather was still sleeping. "You'll never hear him speak again," one of the strangers said. "He has become a spirit," another one said. I still didn't understand, but I hesitated to ask for further explanation. Confused, I sat quietly. It was a long time before my father returned with a doctor who had examined grandfather the night before. The doctor did the same ritual and left. Then my father stood in front of grandfather's bed and put on a grave air. He held up something that looked like a tail mounted with two handles decorated with cowrie shells, stretched it out, put it in grandfather's hand. As soon as the tail touched his hand, grandfather opened his eyes and sat up, all in slow motion. His behavior became strange because he wouldn't let go of the tail my grandfather had given him. He could not use his other hand to support himself while maneuvering to sit up. This seemed very odd to me. Ordinarily, grandfather took an endless time to get up from his couch. He would begin by grinning and groaning while he turned himself over. Then he would grip the mat with his hands and one by one bend his legs. Then he would grip the mat with his hand. From then on, every movement upward would force a yell out of his mouth until he was on his feet. But this time, nothing of the sort happened. Grandfather's torso sat up as if moved by the invisible hand, then became immobile. Following the same impulse, his legs bent over the side of the bed, although they were crackling like dry leaves. Fascinating and speechless, I watched. Everybody seemed captivated. Then he began to rise, as if under a slow and steady impulse, his body resembling one of the village spirit statues. I was not only fascinated, but also afraid that he might lose control and break his back. No one could possibly get up this way without using one or both of their hands to balance their weight. But grandfather's only contact with the ground was with his bare feet, and one could see the muscles of the lower part of his legs compress and straining under the thin, dark skin. Presently, he was standing straight up. This miracle completed, I rushed to him and grabbed his right hand, the one that was free. My father made a movement to stop me, but decided against it. Keeping his authoritative tone, my father spoke to my grandfather in secret primal language. Grandfather said nothing in response. He just walked out of the room, preceded by my father and followed by the delegation. I walked at his right side, still holding his hand. He moved strangely, too straight, too rigid, unnatural, and yet very conscious of any obstacle. Once outside, the crowd joined to make a circle around us. Although I was too young to understand the significance of this ritual or why these people were not speaking to one another, I was glad to return home with grandfather, even if he did not seem to want to speak to me. The 4-mile walk took an equal amount of hours. Dead people don't walk very fast. They are not in a hurry. We must have reached home around noontime, for upon our arrival, we were each walking on his own shadow. People we encountered along our way stopped, left the road, and assumed a somber mood. At home, men and women were everywhere, having come from all directions to wait for grandfather. Those who have arrived earliest were sitting under the shadows of the trees surrounding the compound. Others stood under the biting sun. Many more were still arriving. When we reached the yard outside the main gate, our delegation stopped. 5 old men came out of the compound and saluted us in mystical terms, each one kneeling down with gray hair. I felt proud to be at the for so much attention. They murmured something to grandfather. He continued to be unresponsive, but they did not seem to mind his silence at all. I'm going to stop here for a moment and make a point. Different cultures have different relationships with their dead. And I know very well in a culture of skyscrapers and high technology, dead people don't walk. Instead, they are placed in nice, expensive caskets and driven to the cemetery in elegant black cars. They are put quickly out of sight so that life can go on. Why do the dead walk where I come from? They walk because they are still important to living as they were before. They're even more meaningful as the breadth and depth of our funeral ritual shows. We do not hide their bodies away because we don't want to see their bodies, because we want to see those bodies help us remember the person's life and all the good they did for us. We need to remember that they are well on their way to becoming an ancestor. We must see our dead so that we can truly mourn them all the way through, without restraint, to release the grief from our hearts once and for all. True, every dead person is not asked to walk. My grandfather died on the Mission Hill and thus in a foreign land. He was an elder and a leader of great power and should have died at home. The only way to correct a death of such an important person is when it occurs in the wrong place, is to walk the dead home. Once the funeral ritual is at an end, his body would be carried to the burial ground. Grandfather's eyes were peering at something beyond him, his face and body expressionless. Of all of us, he was the least concerned about what was going on. Presently, the people were cleared away from the gate, and he walked into the compound. Looking behind me, I noticed that the crowd under the trees had stood up and were reverently taking part of everything that was going on. Beyond them, the whole millet field was colored with men and women in blue, white, yellow, red, and black clothing, still arriving. As I arrived at this colorful panorama, I was dragged into the present by a pull from grandfather, who had begun walking again. We walked into his room. There was a kerosene lamp, cast a faint yellow light, disturbed now and then by the wind penetrating from the skylight in the roof. As grandfather moved towards his mud bed, he looked both comic and dramatic. His stiff movements and almost ghastly air gave him a look that was both authoritative and indifferent. He leaned forward just as he was about to reach the low level of his bed. He lifted the left foot and put it hesitantly upon the platform, as if doubting the propriety of his actions. Then he stepped up straight up until he was standing on the bed. Once his equilibrium was established, he turned around and faced the entrance door as if to contemplate a small crowd that had followed him into the room. There was no real eye contact. However, because grandfather was now existing in a space that was beyond the living, although he was physically present with us, he was only really alive in the world of the spirits. My father came to grandfather and took the hyena tail out of his hand, while two robust men supported grandfather from the back. Grandfather let himself fall into their hands. With due ceremony, he was laid out on his couch. Once again, he looked as if he were deeply asleep. Disoriented by the sudden immobility, I looked around me in search of an explanation. The crowd outside was growing rapidly, and I can tell something was very wrong. A little more than 24 hours ago, I had been transported into the future by grandfather's speech. Now he was sleeping peaceably, as if indifferent to what was going on around him. The 5 or 6 men who had accompanied us into grandfather's room were now busy. Some were rearranging the order of the gourds and cans in the room. Others were preparing medicine or lighting aromatic plants. My father had once again disappeared, but I can hear him speaking to a group of old women who are standing at the entrance to grandfather's room. Get the material ready for the meal and warm up the water. Make haste. Everything must be finished before the sun cools down. He came back to grandfather and proceeded to strip him of the remnant of clothing he wore. Then he massaged his body slowly and carefully. One of the men brought a clay pot containing some foaming liquid, inside of which was a double-edged knife. My father lifted grandfather's head, while another man proceeded to shave his white hair. He wetted a portion of the snowy skull and then cleaned away whatever hair was there. Then he collected the fallen hair and handed it to another man near him, who passed it to another, and so on until I lost track of it. Then the shaving went very slowly. When there was nothing left, the hairdresser put the knife back into the pot, then pronounced some lugubrious words. The gourds and cans in the room responded by knocking against one another. At that moment, the women entered the room. They put down an enormous clay jar full of warm water and 3 other medium-sized pots. One contained more water and some seasoning ingredients, and the third some millet flour. The women left without a word. The men rushed to the pot full of warm water and carried it to grandfather's deathbed. They mixed the water and 3 different roots and liquid substances that he had picked out of some of the surrounding gourds and washed his body carefully. Grandfather's last toilet took an interminable time. Those who labored on him were singing solemnly in harmony, a sort of genealogical recital. I can still recall that some of the names, and later I understood that they referred to my very many ancient ancestors. This is very interesting because a lot of times it's kind of slow, this ritual. It makes me think of funerals, especially in the Black church, and how a lot of Black churches, their the funerals are long, right? And kind of drags out. And I know there's another funeral ritual, especially in Louisiana, where they'll actually play a band, and they'll march while playing the band, in Louisiana. So there's, you know, funeral rituals funeral rituals are very different in many different cultures. So this one's actually very interesting to see how they view the person, and how they see the life of that person and how it affects them and their way of thinking in regards to it. And I actually can appreciate it because those of us in the West, when somebody dies, we want to get rid of them quick. Not we want to get rid of them quickly, but we want to bury them quickly. Um, and I don't know, it's like, and we don't, because of this capitalist system, we don't really give people time to mourn. Like we really don't give people true ample time to mourn, right? I think that's a point. Let's continue. After that, these men recited the prayer of the dead. Other men who had not entered into the earlier singing now sang the canticle to the spirits who know no death. These spirits live in the underworld, in the air, in the water, and in the fire. The awesome voices of men tremulously mounting the air like mournful complaint were seconded by other voices outside at the entrance. The women's song was the most thrilling. Men who heard it groan and breathe. Silent. The women's shrill voices rose sharply like daggers and penetrated every heart, blocking our throats, sending chills through our bodies and causing tears to well up in our eyes. I was crying not because grandfather was dead, for up till now I had but a faint idea of what death meant, but because these female singers made such a miserable lament that I was beginning to suspect some sort of tragedy had occurred. The room was suddenly overtaken by a blanket of darkness, thick and heavy, punctuated here and there by something that resembled a yellow glitter, a mild lightning. Behind the singing voices, there was a murmur, an unfailingly monotonous buzzing sound that was coming out of the surrounding gourds and cans. They were hitting against one another as if moved by the ropes that held them in place. Next, I heard the sound of marching feet pounding the ground everywhere in the tiny room. The darkness became deeper and more terrifying. Footsteps also sounded on the roof of the house, and little bits of dirt falling from the ceiling seemed to indicate that the roof was groaning under their weight. Inside, the invisible marching people shouted at each other in a cacophonously, I can't say this word, cacophonously, and stomped loudly in every direction, bumping into invisible objects and fell catastrophically on the ground. The noise was getting to be unbearable. Then everything began to revolve in a circle around me. I had the feeling that I was on a raft that kept turning and turning and not going anywhere. On the left were a half dozen of elderly people, each one my grandfather, and each one making fun of me. They were laughing loudly, mindless of whatever I wanted to ask them. I kept trying to speak to them, but my mouth wouldn't form the questions that my eyes kept asking over and over. The raft finally took off into the air, and in an ultimate movement, it dived into the void like a spaceship. Overtaken by fear, I yelled. Everything ceased instantaneously, and I saw my father bending over me with an anxious face asking, "Are you all right?" I realized I was lying next to grandfather on his bed. They had dressed him up all the way they had dressed up everyone who dies. I still wondered what had happened to me. I'm going to stop there because we're at the 30-minute mark. But what do you think about the funeral ritual for the Dagara tribe, what do you think as compared to our funerals and memorials and how we mourn people here in the West? Because I feel like if we actually had a system where we had all our material needs met and we actually were afforded time to mourn, I think our funeral rituals here in the West would allow us more time to really reflect upon the life of the people who we've lost. And one of the things I detest is that the funeral industry is massive. And a lot of times they will use the most vulnerable point in people's lives to make the most money. I talked about this like last year in a stream, but it just, I honestly do not think that death expenses, I honestly do not think that they should come out of anybody's pocket. Maybe that's the commie in me that's, saying that, but I don't think death expenses should be on the family. I think it should be collectively paid for. And I think people should be able to take the time they need to mourn their loved ones, to take the time that they need. And if we had a system where housing, healthcare, food, basic food and things like that were a human right, then it would be okay. Then you wouldn't have to worry about rushing back to work. You wouldn't have to worry about, rushing back to school, right? You can pick back up where you left off. It just, I think we need a system that's more compassionate to people, especially when we lose loved ones. Just like you should be able to have time off, parental leave, your bereavement leave should be equal in length. And I honestly do believe that we should have up to 2 years parental leave. Now, to some people, that sounds crazy. I think some other countries do parental leave, I think up to 24 months. I think we should equally have bereavement leave that long, up to that long. And if somebody wants to cut it shorter, fine, okay. But I think we should have a bereavement leave for that long. And I think it should be paid, yeah. Because you lost somebody. That's massive. I can get a bereavement leave that's like a few weeks, if you lose a pet. I can get that. But for somebody in your life, like a best friend, a romantic partner, a child, a parent, people need to take time, man. They need time, they need counseling in order to deal with it. So yeah. I think that's something that, really needs to change in this nation. And a lot of indigenous tribes, like the Dagara, they had the right idea. So, with that being said, did you like the stream? Go ahead and give it a like. That pushes me out into the algorithm. And if you have not already, you guys can go to my Substack at jbfont.substack.com. So you guys can get those email notifications whenever I go live, upload clips, or write articles. Now, just want to give a shout out to the patrons on Patreon and Coffee as well as anybody that sends me anything through PayPal. So just going to share this. And I just want to thank you all so very much. To all the patrons on Patreon, Coffee, and PayPal. Hang on, let me. Yeah, there we go. That's better. Yeah, there we. Now we can show it off. Yeah. So thank you so very much to everyone, and we will be doing an update on this list. And for everybody that has contributed or would like to contribute, if you wish to support the channel further, my channel is demonetized. If you like to support the channel, you can support it via Patreon or PayPal. While we're talking about it, let's go show the tiers. All right. So here are the tiers if in case you would like to support. So we have JB members, Solidarity, Comrade, JB Fonters, Super JB Fonters, Super Duper JB Fonters, and Mega JB Fonters. Thank you so very much to all the patrons on Patreon. And in addition to, and furthermore, I want to give a shout out to new patrons, Justin Beth and Andrea Rosario Gabori. I hope I said your name correctly, but thank you so very much for becoming patrons on Patreon. So that is it. Stay tuned for the reading of Bell Hooks, The Will to Change, and then I will be starting on Prejudicial when the book arrives. So you'll be getting that reading there too. So, but yes, I just want to thank you guys for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this. So it was a great read. I had a long day yesterday. I didn't get home till after midnight last night. So that's why I'm a little kind of subdued today. But yes, it was a fun night. So I got to ride some rides. So it was great. But if you guys have not already, go ahead and give a like to the stream on your way out. Water your plants, water yourselves, leave the world better than you found it. Smoke them if you got them, drink them if you got them. If you ain't got them, then watch something funny because joy is revolutionary, or read because reading is fundamental. Take time to mourn. And by the way, mourning does not have a particular time limit. Keep that in mind. So, thank you so very much. Mwah. Forehead kisses to each and every single one of you. I'll see you all in the next one. I love you for watching. Bye. Thank you so very much for watching my channel, and I deeply appreciate it from the top and bottom of my heart. If you wish to support the channel further, so I can keep bringing you content that is educational and informative, you can become a patron on patreon.com/JBFont. You can find that link in the pinned comment or in the description below. No matter what you give, you'll be supporting independent media and education that helps make the world better. Thank you so much, and you can watch more of my content here. Mwah. Forehead kisses, and have a beautiful day.